I would like to welcome you to this online workshop on using the case method online. And in this brief video, what I'm just going to do is go over the objectives of the workshop and what we're going to be covering and how it is going to be organized. Let me begin by quickly listing the objectives of this particular presentation. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the objectives of the workshop overall. Then what we'll do is we will talk about some of the differences between online and face-to-face case discussions. We will then talk about some of the tools that we're using. We'll give a brief summary of what we're going to be covering in asynchronous discussions and how we're going to be covering them. And remember, this workshop focuses only on discussing discussion cases online. There are many other ways that these online tools can be used, but we're going to focus on case studies. And then finally, we'll wrap up with brief comments on synchronous discussions and how we're going to address those over the course of the next few weeks. So if we look at the next couple of weeks, there are a whole bunch of learning objectives that we'd like to achieve. One of the most important is getting a sort of big picture sense of the many similarities between online and classroom case discussions and some of the differences that you'll experience when you move to the online environment. The next thing we will do is we will talk briefly about some of the tools, and we'll think about two different categories of tools, the discussion tools and the tools for content creation and organizing your materials, such as those provided by Moodle, which is the online learning management system that you will be using. We will then talk a little bit about asynchronous discussions, specifically how you might think about preparing for them, how you might conduct the discussions so that it can be done in a reasonable period of time, and how you might evaluate these discussions at the end of the process. And then the workshop will conclude with a synchronous case discussion, and we'll talk a little bit about how you might prepare for that, how you might conduct it and ensure your students are ready, and then finally how you might think about evaluating the synchronous discussion results. So let's think about some of the similarities and differences between online case discussions and classroom case discussions, because I know everyone in this workshop has done a lot of classroom case discussions, and it's not entirely different from going online, but you do have to think about a number of things. We'll first talk about some of the similarities. I can think of three off the top of my head. One is that the objective of a case method course is almost always to build judgment. Now, there are lots of sub-objectives like learning about the context of different businesses and thinking about different roles people might have. But at the heart, what we're trying to do is we're trying to train our participants to make better, more analytical judgments of business situations. Another similarity is peer interaction. The case method is built upon peer-to-peer communication. It differs from other uses of the case method, for example in law school, where it's often more the Socratic method, where the instructor goes back and forth with individual students, and each interaction takes place with the instructor as kind of being the center of the network. In normal case discussions, at least at places like HBS, there's a lot more interaction between peers, and the instructor is more like a conductor than an interlocutor. Finally, of course, they all use discussion cases. I'm presuming that you will be using discussion cases in the online workshop you create, and so the subject matter is the same. Now, how about some of the differences we're likely to experience? And let me emphasize once again, this is particularly applicable to asynchronous discussions. Synchronous discussions using a tool like GoToWebinar actually can become pretty similar to classroom discussions. There's not a lot of adaptation that's required. But when you start having discussions that take place in text mode over a long period of time, there are some big differences. For one thing, you have a totally different assessment challenge. In a classroom case discussion, you're constrained by the fact that you're discussing the case for 75 minutes or an hour and a half or whatever it is, and you as the instructor kind of get a feel for each student's participation, and by the end of the semester, you can make a kind of qualitative assessment, usually not terribly fine-grained, but nevertheless you can make an assessment, and it really doesn't take you a lot of extra time to make that assessment of in-class participation. When you are dealing with asynchronous discussions, you often are dealing with huge amounts of text. It's not unusual for discussions in my class for a single week to end up being 50 or even 100 pages of single-space text. So you have a lot more to assess, but if you don't assess it carefully, students will assume that you're not paying attention and they will cease to put much effort into it. Another big difference is the richness and immediacy. In a face-to-face class, when someone makes a mistake or when someone says something that's a really good point, you can immediately identify that so everyone in the class becomes aware of your assessment. In an online course, essentially you have to deal with discussions that can easily take over a week, and often it's days between an individual's post and useful responses to that post. There is, of course, the question of the timing of preparation. When you enter a classroom discussion, you really need to be fully prepared on the case, because if you're not fully prepared and you get called upon to open or the instructor challenges something you say, then you're in deep trouble if you don't know the case facts. When we're dealing with an asynchronous discussion, a lot of preparations tends to occur while the case is actually being discussed, and you have, as the instructor, have to be aware of that. And then finally, there is the parallelism. In a normal classroom discussion, what will happen is you will have one discussion stream going throughout the whole course. You can't have many people talking at the same time, at least not understand what anyone's saying. So basically, you as the instructor or the facilitator control the flow of the discussion, and it proceeds in a kind of linear manner. When you start talking about doing case discussions online using discussion boards, you'll normally have a number of different threads going on at the same time, so you'll actually have multiple discussions occurring in parallel, and that's a very different dynamic from the classroom. When I was asked to create this workshop for INCAE, I very specifically specified that I wanted to use the tools that you folks were using, which, by the way, are not the tools that I normally use, so we can expect a certain amount of incompetence on my part as we enter any of the live discussions. So, at any rate, the specific tools that we'll be using for this workshop are Moodle will be our learning management system, so everything I do to manage the case will be done through Moodle, as well as all the setup. The conferencing tool that we will use is GoToWebinar. Once again, I will use GoToWebinar to conduct the conferences, even though my entire exposure to GoToWebinar is the one test session that I had earlier today, which lasted about 40 minutes. And then finally, the tool that I use to create videos is Camtasia, and we're not going to be covering that tool specifically, but I strongly encourage you, if you think you may want to create online videos, to go to the Camtasia website, because everything I do that's video related has been created with Camtasia, including this particular presentation. What can you expect when we get to the asynchronous case discussion portion of this class, which, by the way, starts right after the welcome session? Well, my belief has always been that if you are going to learn to use a teaching tool and design courses, you really need to have the experience from the student's perspective first. One of the big challenges that I run into in faculty workshops is very often the faculty members have never taken an online course, they've never participated in an online discussion, and that makes it very hard for them to design one and use one effectively in the classroom. So what we will do is we will actually asynchronously discuss a case called Plagiarism and the Class Project, which is a case that I developed out of my own experiences. It's a real-world case with a bunch of students who were doing an asynchronous exercise that involved writing a book. And when we actually do this discussion, you will be taking the role of students in the process. And the various steps that we'll go through are first, we'll take a look at how the discussion was prepared, how I set it up, and how I set up a series of questions specifically for individuals to get the discussion going. Because I mentioned earlier in this presentation, one of the things about asynchronous discussions is you really want to get them going in parallel as opposed to having one long thread that can take forever. Then we'll talk a little bit about the conduct of the discussion, how I assign openings, the degree of instructor involvement, and there's a whole lot of preferences in this area, and I tend to take a very hands-off approach, but you may want to be much more involved in the discussions yourselves, and you may also decide that you want to change how you approach things over the course of the semester that you teach, or perhaps experiment a little bit and see how different things work. And then finally, I'll talk about different ways you might close off a discussion to leave students feeling a little bit more closure about the way the case goes, which is something that's often very difficult with asynchronous cases. Then finally, I'll talk a little bit about assessment. Assessment is incredibly important in asynchronous cases because the students typically do not have any real feedback as to how involved you are. And one of the ways you can demonstrate your involvement is by taking a lot of time with assessment. And that is one of the big challenges of asynchronous discussions because the assessment process can take a great deal of time. And one of the things you'll see is a sample wrap-up that I prepared for the Plagiarism in the Class Project case, and how I then have students fill in a post-case form that does their kind of evaluation of learning, which I have found to be extremely helpful. The portion of the workshop on synchronous case discussions, which occurs very near the end of the workshop, is actually going to be a lot more familiar to most of you, and it's going to be much, much shorter, because I would say the best way to do synchronous discussions online using a tool such as GoToWebinar is to try to get them as similar as possible to the way you do it in the classroom. And that's actually not that difficult using the tools that are available to us. So some of the things we'll talk about is how you might ensure students are prepared for a case, some of the setup. I use a pre-case question in my classes, and then we'll take a little look at the environment that you'll be using, the GoToWebinar, though this is not my area of expertise, but fortunately you already have a lot of expertise in that area at INCAE. Then we'll talk a little bit about the conduct of the discussion, what you can use instead of a whiteboard. With the GoToWebinar tool, you actually end up typing stuff into a PowerPoint slide, for example, instead of a whiteboard might be a normal way to do it. And we'll talk about the possibility of chat, because in a lot of synchronous tools, you have a text chat that students are doing going on in parallel with the actual audio chat that's going on while people are discussing the case. Now, GoToWebinar basically does not facilitate that like other tools. They have a place where students can ask questions, and then they have a place where you can send out chat messages. But in many of the synchronous tools, you actually will have a continual stream of chat going on while you are discussing the case in audio channels. And then finally, I will talk about how you might evaluate and assess case performance, which is pretty similar to the classroom, but I always recommend using the same post-case form that I talk about for the asynchronous discussions, because I've found it's been very, very useful for me in understanding what students have learned. So with this, you are now ready to begin the next phase of this workshop, which is the asynchronous discussion.